Recording is now in process. Welcome, Professor VanLandingham.
Linnea, thank you so very much for having me here today. And thank you to the entire League of Women Voters of Greater Los Angeles. And really to all of you that have made time in your very busy schedules to tune in virtually today. And again, I'm beyond honored to share my thoughts with you. I have organized my remarks into three main parts. First, an introductory section to thank you, and selfishly to take some time to exhort you to engage even more in our democracy, one that I believe is under grave threat. The second component of my remarks is a brief overview, or not so brief overview, of some of the steps I've identified that have been taken by the current Trump administration to militarize really more than just immigration, even though it's linked to that. And third, in conclusion, I'll briefly turn to, why the militarization, why the turn to war rhetoric and to war powers, and outline which most of which are obvious, but outline some of the dangers of such militarization. So for my introductory, and I really, as a professor, and I've just been teaching this morning since 9 o'clock, I don't like to read to people, but given the format that I am going to do some little more formal reading, and then I'm going to turn a little bit more informally and do more of a instruction. I will not go the full 45 minutes. I do want to really have a colloquy, a dialogue with the engaged and smart people that are here today to listen. So again, thank you. I just want to say that given the League's storied history of really nonpartisan activism to encourage all Americans to exercise what I still view as our incredible right to vote, the time could not be more pressing for those with this great privilege to vote, to tune into what's happening in our country and the world, and to educate themselves on the issues. I really strongly believe, and that's why I'm an educator now, that the time is now to expend the great intellectual and emotional energy it actually does take to cut through the loud cacophony of information, much of it not true, that we are bombarded with daily, and judge whether this is the direction we want our country to go in, and to take peaceful and hopefully loud steps to make our voices heard. And of course, why the ballot box is preeminent in making our voices heard in our constitutional democracy. Given the dilution of the voting power through increased partisan gerrymandering and efforts to make voting more difficult rather than easier, I fear and know that voting is simply not enough. You all and I and all of us, we all also need to show up like you are today to public events to relay a dismay about our erosion of constitutional freedoms. And perhaps even more importantly, we need to show up to share our concerns by having conversations with other people, conversations with our neighbors when we see them, when we go out to get the mail, when we're grocery shopping at the local Ralph's. As I remind my students, we all have spheres of influence of varying sizes, and we can all perform public service, if you will, by conversations in those spheres about the most pressing issues of the day. So I commend you and thank you again for showing up today, because it's very easy to feel powerless. But oh, we the people have power. And the magic of that power lies in our relationships with others. And those relationships are sustained and built through conversations and shared values. And we can almost always find several shared values, even with people that we vehemently disagree with on many, many issues. We can, as individuals, change minds, and we should remain open to changing our minds as well when we're faced with facts that support the rational conclusions. Learning is a lifelong process, and I feel honored to be a professor to continue to engage in this learning. And I do want to make one last point in my introduction, and that's, as I'll explain the relevance of this statement, hopefully, toward the end of my remarks. But we should always remember that feelings, that emotions are a form of cognition. They are a form of thinking. That's what the current cognitive neuroscience is revealing more and more. And that our thoughts are actually driven and shaped by our feelings. So creating feelings in order to prompt action or to chill action is what masterful leaders do. Validating feelings, being empathetic to why people believe certain things that you personally may find offensive, will help us provide a foundation to have real conversations that make real differences with real people. We cannot argue our way out of emotions. We have to recognize them, validate the right of the person that we're engaging with to have those emotions, even if they're not doing that for us, and appreciate out loud that there's a reason they feel and hence think the way they do. Casting one another and casting people as good or bad, blue versus red, terrorists versus patriots, etc., is simply a tool of manipulation, and it ignores the complex, nuanced human beings that we all are. It's far, far easier to think in black and white. But easier is not better, and easier is not accurate, and easier is not going to bring us to a calmer, more peaceful, more democratic place in our country. Okay, so now to the heart of why I was asked to speak today, and this is part 2 of my remarks on the militarization of immigration, and I've thought deeply about this and this label, which was really just a catch-all. And so when Linnea first reached out to me this summer to have the honor of speaking with you today, I had just published a few opinion pieces, op-eds, and I was also on CNN and some other news outlets regarding President Trump's June, what we could call invasion of Los Angeles, or what some would also call the appropriate use of military force in response to unchecked violence, through his truly unprecedented federalization of the California National Guard, sending over 4,000 National Guard as well as active duty Marines here to downtown Los Angeles, where I sit right now. And he did so when he did, he usurped Governor Newsom's authority over his own state militia, and what I believe was a performative message of intimidation to blue cities across the country that he was in charge. They'd better bow down to him and his mask-wearing secret police, as the latter continues to jump out of unmarked vans in Home Depot parking lots. They continue to terrorize neighborhoods, racially profile our neighbors, and they're now doing so seemingly with the imprimatur of the Supreme Court. But honestly, that time in June does seem so long ago, because I believe we've skidded far and fast down a slide of authoritarianism since then. So I thought I would take us through a bit of a journey of some of the concrete actions President Trump and his administration have taken that contribute to what I and others have very loosely labeled the militarization of immigration, but is broader than immigration itself, and really about how brute force is being used by those we the people are given the power to utilize such force in our name. And I do want to briefly discuss the why behind such militarization, both the strategic and pragmatic aspects. So within this part 2 of the broad concept of the militarization of immigration, plus, I kind of want to highlight first, or I do want to highlight first, that what I mean by militarization. And, I generally use that label to refer to the use of the United States military, our armed forces, in ways that grossly deviate from the norms of how the U.S. military is used domestically, how it should be used domestically, as well as what we've lately witnessed as extreme deviations from how our military is used externally as well outside the rule of law. So before I turn to the domestic component, I want to turn briefly to what I was live on CNN earlier this week on Monday discussing with Jake Tapper, as well as on MSNBC on Tuesday discussing, and that's the extraordinary use of the United States military to do what I call, and I think accurately label, as murder on the high seas. So, within the last month, President Trump has ordered the extrajudicial killings. That's a really nice kind of bland phrase for murder of individuals in boats in international waters without providing a legal basis for doing so. This is an extraordinary use of lethal force in the American people's name, and this is why. We as a nation have long, though imperfectly, committed ourselves to the rule of law versus the rule of man, domestically as well as internationally, by, among other things, leading the charge to develop legal frameworks for the use of force. The default framework for the use of force by governments, by our government, is peacetime law enforcement. And in peacetime law enforcement, lethal, that is deadly force, can only be used in response to an imminent threat of deadly force. There was simply no evidence provided that the 2 boats that were blown out of the water, killing, I believe, my public math, there are 14 individuals, 11 in the first and 3 in the second. There was zero evidence provided by our administration that these boats, the individuals on these boats, presented an imminent threat to the United States, US citizens, or anyone else. Indeed, both of these incidents were described by the president as lawful killings because the individuals posed a threat because to the United States and to our national security because of the drugs they were allegedly carrying to the United States, though they were over 1,000 miles away, that would eventually, as claimed by the president, kill people. So what the president is stating is called an allegation of criminality for which we arrest people, which what the United States Coast Guard and United States Navy have been doing for years now, interdicting individuals for whom they have probable cause to believe are carrying illegal substances, interdicting them based on that probable cause, arresting them, and then providing them the full panoply of judicial and procedural safeguards that are the hallmark of our criminal justice system. Instead, what President Dunn has decided to simply kill them. The only other lawful use of force under international and US domestic law, if we're not in a peacetime law enforcement framework when we're facing an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death, would be the law of war, something that unfortunately I've had more experience than I would like, both advising commanders on its implementation and teaching hundreds of law students regarding its meaning and advising members of the armed forces on its content. So under the law of war, which requires a war, requires actual armed conflict, status-based killing is allowed. Individuals can be killed because of who they are. That is, members of state armed forces against whom we are fighting an armed conflict, or members of what are called organized armed groups against whom we are actually at war against. There indeed are legal criteria for determining when we are at war against either another state or an organized armed group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. These drug cartels simply do not fit into any definition of what armed conflict is against an organized armed group, which requires a prolonged violence of the intensity that looks like war, or that they're about to engage in a major strike against the United States that's imminent and for which we are forced to use lethal force in self-defense. Simply did not exist. There are legal criteria for determining when we are at war against an organized armed group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And simply because the president waved his magic wand and declared them foreign terrorist organizations does not mean we are at war against them, that the president is allowed to use war powers to simply blow them out of the water. That was the ordering of a crime, the ordering of murder, and those individuals in the United States Armed Forces should have disobeyed that manifestly unlawful order, and they were responsible for murder too and should be prosecuted eventually for it. These military kinetic strikes were murder. And how is this related to immigration and the militarization of immigration? It was the use of military forces in order to murder people on the high seas because allegedly they were members of a Venezuelan gang/drug cartel, one that the president earlier this year invoked a wartime statute from the 18th century to attempt to summarily deport individuals that his administration alleged were members of this drug cartel. So this act of lawlessness, the killing an American's name outside of the law carried out by the military, is very much linked to this overall topic of the militarization of immigration because it demonstrates the perversion of the use of the military with regard to this administration's quote-unquote war on immigration, its war on drugs, and seemingly the Constitution itself. I fear that this arbitrary and unlawful campaign of killing by the United States military of alleged drug cartel members when they are not posing an imminent, deadly threat, and that we're not at war against, either domestically or internationally, will not stop with 2 boats blown out of the water on the high seas. It will eventually be replicated at the U.S. southern border with possible military strikes against alleged drug cartel members and their drug labs in Mexico. That's actually a law review essay scenario that I wrote and gave to my students this past spring I certainly hope it doesn't come to fruition, but carefully parsing what the president and his administration officials have stated, I fear that's where we're going. So on to that journey of the militarization of immigration. I mentioned outside of the murder on the high seas, the attempt for the president to use an 18th century law that requires either declared war or invasion to attempt to summarily deport individuals his administration claimed were Venezuelan citizens. So what I'm talking about was the use earlier this year by the president to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This is something that I've long taught in my national security law class. I never thought I'd be talking about it real time, but I always taught it and exposed it to students to say that we've got some pretty broad laws on the books that vest the president with incredible inordinate authority to use basically in case of emergency, because the president of the United States has been trusted to use his or her discretion wisely in case of true emergency like war. And instead, I see an abuse of many of these laws. So again, coming back to something can be lawful but awful. We have many laws that are quite broad. But perhaps this one wasn't broad enough. So going back, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a US federal law that does allow the president to either detain or deport citizens of a nation considered an enemy of the United States because we're at war. So the statute itself says during a declared war, an invasion, or a threatened predatory incursion. We saw this authority used basically in the War of 1812, World War I, and most notoriously and really shamefully used to justify the internment of people of Japanese descent here in the United States during World War II, as well as we saw, of course, American citizens detained summarily as well without individualized suspicion or due process. In the infamous Korematsu case in which the Supreme Court gave the imprimatur for doing so. And we saw Chief Justice Roberts a few years ago formally and finally apologize for such unconstitutional detentions. So President Trump in March invoked the Alien Enemies Act for the first time since World War II in order to order the very fast detention and deportation of Venezuelan migrants that he suspected of being members of the Tren de Aragua prison, the gang. And he treated them basically that they were wartime enemies of the U.S. government, and he stated so in his proclamation. And he argued that the gang members were perpetrating, attempting, and threatening an invasion or predatory incursion against the territory of the United States, which of course is the exact legal threshold for invoking that authority. And he ordered the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice to apprehend, restrain, secure, and remove every Venezuelan migrant 14 or older who they deemed to be part of Tren de Aragua and who lacked U.S. citizenship or permanent residency. So that would make these individuals eligible for summary arrest, detention, and deportation without any of the rather minimal, but they're still there, due process protections that are outlined in U.S. immigration law. So this attempt to deem these particular migrants as enemies, right, using a wartime authority, was to sidestep any kind of due process, to sidestep requirements to bring them before the third branch of government, before the federal judiciary, or before at least immigration judges, which are not part of the federal judiciary, but are Article 1 judges created by statute that work for the executive branch. But it sidesteps all of that due process, which normally includes an opportunity to see a judge and request asylum. They would be treated as enemy aliens and processed under our laws and summarily deported. But we found that the U.S. federal courts have found this to be an abuse of the law. And why? I mean, the basic holding from the Fifth Circuit, which voted 2-1, which found 2-1 that this was a broad violation, a broad abuse of the Alien Enemies Act, because its predicate fact of either a declared war or invasion was not met, that there simply was no invasion. We'll see this head to the Supreme Court. And so so meanwhile, the president has been enjoined from using the Alien Enemies Act to summarily deport individuals at this point. So we see that this there's a marshal that is wartime connection to both the ordering of murder of alleged Venezuelan cartel members 1,000 plus miles away from the United States, with this Alien Enemies Act abuse to summarily deport individuals from that same country. We see that the president is writing a narrative, painting a picture to demonstrate that we actually are at war against Venezuelan drug gangs and maybe even Venezuela itself. And why is that? Why the narrative? And I'll conclude this with my remarks today with this thought, but I do believe it's to both unlock the vast powers that have been statutorily granted to the executive branch, to the president, when we actually are at war, when we are in an armed conflict. So it's both to unlock those vast powers and to pursue the president's agenda lawfully, and I think perhaps even more powerfully, this militarization narrative, though the martial narrative of being at war and harnessing military powers to pursue particular ends, is to harness those emotions of us versus them and national unity and support for the president that comes with actually being at war. Because if we're at war, that means the people we're fighting are dangerous because of who they are and they want to hurt us. And we should be afraid. And therefore, we should sacrifice our civil liberties to the president so he can save us from such threats. The emotional manipulation that comes with war, being at war, painting individuals as enemies, in combination with the vast legal powers that come with actual war, lawful powers our Congress has delegated to the president in time of armed conflict and national security danger, cannot be overstated. So I believe these are actual plays that are straight out of an authoritarian's playbook, and they are being played and played adroitly. So let's go through a little more of this journey of the militarization of immigration. And then I would love to have a discussion and questions and dialogue with the individuals who are, again, taking their time today to be here. So let's talk about the border strips that have been militarized and turned into, federal military installations, as well as really why I was invited today. I think that the tip of this was the deployment of the U.S. National Guard as well as active duty troops into U.S. cities, and really in unprecedented manners. So as I dive into that, again, I always break everything down into subparts. The first part of this component of the militarization of immigration is really an outline of the basic outline of the United States military and its role in our constitutional democracy. Because without a true understanding of how the founding fathers and surely founding mothers as well envisioned the role of our military within our democracy, it's hard to understand how much of a gross deviation we're actually seeing from what is the norm and why it became the norm and why it should still be the norm. So that basic outline is this. We have the United States military is comprised of three basic components. The United States Armed Forces, to use a broad label. We have the professional, what's called standing military. That's our active duty force, right? We have the active duty force hours, part of our active duty, where individuals either enlist or are commissioned. That is, enlisted members enlist, officers are commissioned into the military, and they are essentially owned by the military. They are subject to the United States, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the penal code, the federal military penal code that only applies to individuals either on active duty or who are on active duty orders, which does limit some of their constitutional rights, not all of them. They still have core First Amendment protected speech rights, which are currently being persecuted by this administration. They are allowed to have political affiliations. They are allowed to vote. They're allowed to have personal political opinions and ideological opinions they can share online. Those are being right now, there's a witch hunt that's being engaged in by the Pentagon, by the Trump administration against our warriors who have volunteered to serve our country. And I find it horribly offensive. But we have the active duty military, and those are individuals that serve for a particular contractual period of time, even though that contractual period of time can be extended by the government. And people kept in when there's a national security need for under a series of statutes. So you have the active duty military, and then we have both the reserves, and those are individuals that are civilians. Most of the time, they have full-time jobs, but they have agreed to serve our country as reservists and do a particular amount of training every year, and that they basically supplement the active duty. They work there. They work purely for the federal government. They are reservists, and in time of need, there are statutes that can be invoked in order to call the reserve those that are reserve officers and enlisted members to supplement our active duty. But the third chunk of the armed forces is what was referred to as the militia, and then they're referred to as the militia within the Constitution itself. And Article 1, we have the militia clauses. The militia are today's National Guard. Our founding fathers envisioned the militia, the true citizen soldier, to be the bulk of our military force. And why? Each one of the states, when the United States actually became the United States, had their own National Guard, their own militias that worked for the governor because they needed to protect their particular states, help the governor with domestic law enforcement if needed, help with natural disaster, etc. The citizen soldiers were not viewed as a threat to our democracy because they were true citizen soldiers. They had day jobs, and then several times a month and throughout the year, they'd be called up by their governor to engage in training. And that training via a series of statutes in which Congress passed based on the militia clauses in Article 1 of the Constitution allowed Congress to say, look, we're going to require you National Guard members, you militia, to adhere to the same standards as active duty, because in time of war, in time of invasion, in time of rebellion, we may need to call you up in order to help protect our country. So the militias, the National Guard, were viewed as not as a far less of a threat to our democracy because they worked for their governors and they were one of us. Their day jobs were working in the grocery stores, working in the fields, working in the post office, or engineers, etc. I mean, if I want to modernize it to today, they're not the boogeyman standing professional army that's in DC and that is a threat to democracy. Our founding fathers, you can look at numerous of the Federalist Papers, such as 24 and 25, and mention this fear of standing armies and why the founding fathers saw what the British redcoats did to the colonists. They were suppressing civil liberties, quartering the British troops in people's houses without their permission, basically saying, we're going to take over your house and you're going to feed us and we're going to live here. And so there was a fear that a large standing army, a large professional force that did nothing but military stuff each and every day, the active duty forces, that they could become a tool for a tyrannical president to suppress civil liberties and to eventually destroy democracy and in order to maintain their power. And so the vision within the United States Constitution is that these militias, a National Guard, would be the bulk of the force. But once we had World War I and World War II, we did see that we have a huge standing army, incredibly large, supposedly apolitical standing army, and the apolitical nature is being quickly degraded right now with the witch hunts that are going on. But we have a huge standing army, but that we still have the National Guard. So the National Guard in their day-to-day lives work for their governors. They work for their governors. Their governors primarily use them for basic, for natural disaster response, for helping with that reaction to pandemics such as COVID. And they are allowed to be used by the governors when governors see fit under each state's particular laws to deputize, basically to give National Guard members the ability to perform law enforcement, to supplement our police forces, our local police forces. And it's state's primary responsibility for law enforcement on our day-to-day streets. So, and it was not a feared idea that these National Guard members would actually be that we shouldn't allow them to engage in law enforcement. No, these are citizen soldiers. These are our neighbors that we see every day, that we work with. We weren't afraid that they were going to be used by a tyrannical governor to suppress our civil liberties, but that they would be needed to engage in law enforcement to supplement police when necessary. For example, Governor Brown, or Governor Wilson, excuse me, called out the California National Guard during the 1992 riots. in order to conduct law enforcement, excuse me, to help supplement the LAPD. And then he requested that the president provide additional forces as well. Asked for additional forces to be able to provide for law enforcement. So posse comitatus, where does that fit in? So there was never been a fear and there's never been a prohibition against governors using their own National Guard troops for law enforcement purposes in their own states. However, there's been a long-standing norm that was eventually crystallized into federal law against using federal troops, the active duty troops, or National Guard members that now work for the president because they've been quote unquote federalized. There's been a long-standing norm against, as well as statutory prohibition against using those forces on our city streets to engage in law enforcement, except in case of emergency, which I'll describe in a moment. And why? And that's called the Posse Comitatus Act, which actually had a pretty distasteful beginning. Even despite the fact that our founding fathers had made it very clear that they feared troops, a standing army, active duty troops or militia that was actually working for the president to be used for law enforcement on our city streets because they feared abuses. After the Civil War, we had the Union Army, the United States Army, patrolling the city streets, basically engaged in military occupation of the South because they had just beaten the South in a very bloody and horrible cataclysmic civil war. So the United States Army was running courts, was policing, was engaged in essentially domestic occupation of the United States, and for good reason. There were some abuses by the U.S. Union Army in the South at the time. But what Southern senators really didn't like was the fact that the 14th Amendment was actually being enforced, and they wanted to be able to implement Jim Crow laws and engage in racial segregation, and deny recently freed Black Americans from engaging in their constitutionally protected activities. And they wanted to engage in white supremacy, and the Union Army was preventing them from doing so. So we had Southern senators sponsor what became known as the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits active duty troops, anyone that works for the president that's military. So that's always going to be active duty troops, as well as federalized National Guard troops, because the president has the authority under statute that flows directly, federal statute flows directly from the First Amendment of the Constitution, what are called the militia clauses, the ability to reach out to states and federalize them, saying, I'm going to take your National Guard and they're going to work for me. And the president can do so without the consent of that particular state governor. That's rare to do it without the state governor, as what occurred in June of this year here in Los Angeles, but it happens. And ostensibly we do have statutes that allow for that. Whether or not the factual predicate was met for federalizing those troops is a different and more ambiguous topic. So we had the Posse Comitatus Act, which passed during Reconstruction to kick the Union Army out of the South, so that the South could engage in Jim Crow laws and suppress the Black vote, etc. But what it did was actually codify a longstanding prohibition against using federal troops, either active duty troops or federalized National Guard troops, from engaging in what's law enforcement, basic law enforcement on the streets, which we've never had a Supreme Court case that directly defined what is law enforcement. But you know it when you see it, to quote Justice Potter Stewart, and we do have some lower court cases that analyze the issue. I mean, arrests, right? And things that are regulatory, compulsory, or prescriptive. Arrests, searches and seizures, stopping us on the city streets, right? Those are classic law enforcement activities, and they are prohibited by those in uniform unless they're National Guard members working for our governors, or, and here's the big or, unless the president has declared that there's such an emergency that he's got to use federalized troops, either active duty or federalized National Guard. They are indistinguishable legally once they're federalized. National Guard works for the president. They are no different, have no other legal authorities, and are limited by the same legal restraints as active duty members. They cannot be used for law enforcement, for patrolling our streets, from engaging in immigration raids, etc. Unless the president invokes and unless there is an actual statutory or constitutional exception. It's long been the view of scholars that there is no constitutional exception. But that's now at issue, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the clear statutory exception is the Insurrection Act. So the Insurrection Act is actually a series of statutes that have been amended over time that allow, it's the break the glass in case of emergency for the president to be able to declare that we have such an emergency because we're being invaded, or we have a rebellion, or you otherwise cannot enforce federal law on our city streets, that he's actually going to say, I need to use the military to enforce our laws because I've got one of those types of situations. It's incredibly rare. It's incredibly rare because that's basically saying everything has hit the fan. We cannot, the police, local governors cannot control what's going on anymore. I'm going to have to go in, and I'm going to have to go in with force. And so we saw presidents doing that without governor's consent, very rarely. For example, during the civil rights era, in order to enforce the desegregation of of the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, we did see the president then federalizing National Guard troops in order to protect the individuals to help ensure that their constitutional right to attend school was enforced. So the fact that President Trump did that in Los Angeles in June, I'll go into in a moment, is very unlike the situation. And so he did not use the Insurrection Act. So he has not triggered the Insurrection Act to be able to claim that he can use active duty as well as federalized National Guard troops on our city streets in law enforcement. Instead, his administration is simply arguing they weren't engaged in law enforcement. So posse comitatus prohibition doesn't apply. It's not law enforcement. And even if it was, we've got a constitutional exception under force protection of federal property and federal agents and federal resources. Okay, I'm going to get to that in a moment. So that was our big picture, and I'm looking at the time. I also of our basic schematic of the military and its vision within particular domestic law enforcement. I want to highlight, before I go back to the deployment of troops within U.S. cities, that one of the concrete militarization steps taken by this administration has also been, besides building detention centers on military bases, he has turned a strip of federal land that was spanning 3 states but is now expanded into a military installation, making it sovereign federal territory, essentially to quote unquote address the emergency that he's declared over unlawful immigration and drug trafficking. And what is the bottom line of doing that, of creating a whole swath of land on the southern border that's a military installation? It basically allows the military to engage in law enforcement activities on that military installation without ever needing to invoke the Insurrection Act, without running afoul of the Posse Comitatus Act, because it's a military installation. The Posse Comitatus Act applies to our city streets and never applied to federal sovereign territory of a military base, right? And so we have soldiers who can apprehend, that is engaged in law enforcement, arrest individuals that are on this military installation who are now subject to criminal trespass charges for trespassing on a federal military installation that at the beginning of this year didn't even exist. We have them searching and detaining people who are crossing over into this military installation. So on top of being subject to criminal law regarding the illegal entry, they're now being subject to criminal law regarding unlawful trespass into these militarized zones. So we have that, and it has been expanded. And I think I tried to find the last number. I saw a number of like 1,400 individuals who had been arrested for, detained for such illegal trespass into these military installations, into these zones. They were charged with trespassing. They face an 18-month prison sentence for the first offense, and that's on top of the illegal entry charge that brings an additional 6 months in custody. And again, that's a part of the militarization of immigration prong, this creation of these broad swaths of territory that are now a military installation that allow the military, our U.S. Armed Forces, to engage in law enforcement activities. Interestingly and specifically, I want to highlight, yes, we've had U.S. forces, particularly National Guard forces, including California National Guard forces, as part of a federal mission on the border for years, going back to the Obama administration. But they were providing logistical support that was not considered law enforcement. So the deviation from the standard norm here is that they're now engaging in law enforcement when they're not appropriately trained for law enforcement. So that brings up issues. And is that what we want our military doing, is arresting people? Okay. So finally, given the sense of time, I shouldn't have saved the best for last. And that again is going back to the deployment, the federalization, the nationalization of what came to be about 4,000 troops, California National Guard troops in June, by President Trump, as well as the deployment of about 700 active duty Marines into downtown Los Angeles. So the federal statute that President Trump did rely on. That's what I originally wrote about, that I thought at the time that it was lawful, because it allows the president, without the consent of the governor, right? Not to say that it was right, not to say that it was normatively appropriate for the facts at the time, but allowed the president to federalize without consent of Governor Newsom, the California National Guard, because of fear that the federal laws were not being executed, that there was rebellion against federal law. And he cited the individuals that were evidence that individuals were trying to block ICE agents from engaging in ICE detentions, etc. Since then, we did see an injunction against that. We saw that injunction overturned by the Supreme Court, but we did see the federal trial judge, Judge Breyer, who was Justice Breyer's brother, find separately, outside of whether or not it was lawful to engage to use that particular component to nationalize the National Guard, which I think will be found as a lawful use. Separately, there was never, the Insurrection Act was never invoked, and didn't go through its process to allow these federalized troops to engage in law enforcement. And yet they were going on raiding cannabis farms, going on ICE raids with ICE to protect ICE. And I think Judge Breyer found, to make it very simple, did find that those ICE raids and the use of National Guard troops that worked for the president on those ICE raids was pure law enforcement. And so that was a violation of posse comitatus, because there was no legal basis. There was no Insurrection Act exception. Again, the administration relied on the very broad argument that, well, they were just force protection. They were for force protection. Well, if you're protecting law enforcement while they're engaged in law enforcement, that's law enforcement. We will wind up seeing this case, which is now in front of the Ninth Circuit, go to the Supreme Court. And we're seeing, of course, threats of deployments of National Guard members, of nationalizing the Guard members and sending active duty troops into Memphis, which will be a different issue because the governor has said it's okay, and into Chicago, et cetera. And of course, we've seen what's happened in Washington, D.C., which Washington, D.C. is its own sui generis, very different situation, because essentially the president is analogous, has the powers over the DC National Guard as a governor. So he does not have to, there's no posse comitatus issue. But there, it's the normative issue is, do we really want the National Guard to be out there picking up garbage? Is that the best use of our forces that are supposed to be training to the standards to defend our country against external threats? And I have gone way longer than I meant to. I could talk about this stuff all day. I definitely want to save some time for questions and comments, but the why, I think which I'd said I would say in conclusion and I already did, but I'll say it again, regarding militarizing and immigration and militarizing any kind of public policy tries to unlock and does unlock in certain circumstances wide swaths of power that have been granted legally, statutorily by Congress to the president. And two, it really makes us afraid and feeds into a narrative of fear and coalescence behind our national government when, oh, we want them to beat our enemies who are trying to hurt us, but who are these enemies that he's trying to paint us into believing? So I talked a long time and I'd love to have some questions. Thank you.
Well, I have a question right away. So it seems to me that the liberal press has often treated Donald Trump as if he's kind of unmoored and thoughtless and just sporadic, acting just on the moment. And so his actions are often treated as if they're kind of isolated, maybe unlawful acts. But I think you have pointed out that they're actually forming a coherent narrative. You have, and that coherent narrative is actually much more frightening than the narrative of, well, he just did this yesterday and tomorrow he'll do that. So if this is a coherent narrative that is being carefully crafted, it must have an end purpose. And what do you think the ending point is?
Linnea, thank you for that terrific question. You know, I'm afraid to articulate what I think the endpoint is because I've written numerous essay problems that actually came into fruition when I just from reading the tea leaves. I mean, I once gave an essay problem that President Assad of Syria was going to use chemical weapons against his own people, and 2 years later it happened. I had students write me back, so I'm afraid to do this. But I mean, I think it's a move toward and a slide toward authoritarianism. There are individuals that very much have what I believe is and I grew up Catholic, so I have nothing against Christians. A Christian theocracy, white supremacy based authoritarian government, very much a worldview, ideology on those tenets that is controlled by what I believe is the far right, by the individuals like Stephen Miller or J.D. Vance now that want to instill and impose a particular ideology, and one in white supremacy, one I find that to be quite misogynistic, and based on and with a preference toward Christianity, so almost a theocracy of type. And I think that sounds very outlandish, just articulating it out loud, but it's hard not to see these pieces coming together with that, and basically a destruction of the international world order, in which it's just going to be might makes right again, which is something we tried to move away from as a global community after World War II because of things like nuclear weapons. But I think domestically there is a plan, and when one reads Project 2025 and sees what's happening all since January, it's very much a controlling, ideological, authoritarian, nationalistic journey that we're on, and that leads to an authoritarian state.
Well, so I'm not able to see the participants. Lauren, can you show me the participants?
And I think Lauren also has a question or a comment.
Lauren, do you have a question? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I do. And yes, to your question, I can look at the participants, but there are questions within the Q&A. So, Professor
Rachel,
VanLandingham,
please. For
did I? Okay. Rachel, thank you very much for that presentation. I can tell you that my neighborhood was ground zero for ICE enforcement, including that stunt with the rental truck and the promise of work. But if I can take a little, move a little away from the tenor of this, or not the tenor, but the subject matter. We know from history that when they start attacking the most vulnerable of us, they're coming for the rest of us. And I'm wondering if you have been following the HR 5300 that was introduced in Congress, which would give unilateral powers to the Secretary of State to cancel passports, refuse to issue passports for American citizens. And the criteria only means you have to be charged. You don't have to be convicted. And for those who are listening, I'm going to put the link to that bill into the chat.
Oh, thank you so much for that. No, I had not been following that. It seems like there's so much to follow every single day, and I will definitely look at that again. I mean, that I don't see any good reason for having that, and I just see that as a gross abuse of power, that would give unchecked power as to the Secretary of State to determine, who deserves to travel. And if we cancel a passport and you're overseas, how do you get back? And who deserves to be within our national community? And that's terribly, terribly frightening.
Well, I feel like I've gone through a law class. I've sat in on one of your law classes. But Susan has a question, and she writes, are there no consequences for Trump flaunting his power in killing the people on the Venezuelan boats?
Well, the United States is not a party to the International Criminal Court, even though we helped write and draft the Rome Treaty, but we decided that we wanted the United Nations Security Council to be the final say on who is indicted under the International Criminal Court, because we're a permanent party, a permanent voting member of the United Nations Security Council, so we can veto anything that'll stop it. And so since the Rome Treaty that established the International Criminal Court did not employ the United States Security Council as a requirement for an indictment, we pulled out and decided we weren't going to be part of it. So there is no international body to go in and judicially, according to norms and process and the law, to go after President Trump. The only accountability would be Congress saying we don't, passing something. They say, nope, this is far outside the bounds of your domestic and international authority to do so. And pressure, the soft power pressure that comes from opprobrium of other nations. But given that the United States is the most powerful nation in the world and we see other countries very leery to run afoul of President Trump, I see very little accountability. I wish that members of the military would stand up and say no. Because if you get enough to say no, then it's not going to happen. And I think they absolutely have a legal duty to say no, because I think those are manifestly unlawful orders to kill people outside of a legal framework to do so. And it takes people's willingness to do things that they're not supposed to do in order for there to be for this illegality to be conducted. And so I really wish there'd be I think the accountability needs to come from people saying this is not right, we're not going to do this. I mean, this really needs to be a grassroots kind of accountability, and I'm not really seeing it. And I'm not seeing it much from Congress. We of course have individuals that are trying to speak out. And I think speaking out is becoming more perilous. I mean, we have an abuse of the government licensing power to go after a comic. And he didn't even say anything that egregious. I've heard comics say far worse. And even if he had said far worse, the Supreme Court has been adamant since the speech suppressive era of World War I that even hate speech is protected. The Supreme Court allowed the Ku Klux Klan to march through Skokie, Illinois, celebrating the Holocaust. And they're like, well, that's awful, but it's lawful because that's what the First Amendment protects. And so that now that the government is abusing its power to go after its ideological opponents or anyone that says anything it doesn't like is incredibly scary. So the ability to speak out is going to take courage, and the ability to say, no, we're not going to follow those unlawful orders for those within the Pentagon. It's a time for moral courage, but there's strength in numbers. And that's where, but it's got to start with people, and there's got to be a tipping point of saying, no, we're not gonna take this anymore. But for your question regarding accountability, well, with the Supreme Court's decision in the Trump case, that gives him vast immunity for actions carried out within his executive purview. He's immune, and he's taking advantage of that. So I don't see any accountability for his ordering of murders of individuals on the high seas. I see accountability on the pages of history regarding these kind of overreaches, because I think the overreaches are the things that will finally get people to pay attention to say, this has gone too far. But I do think if no one's going to stop him and say no, then he's going to continue to engage in the decision to anyone that he calls a terrorist that he can just use lethal force against. And members of his administration have called the Democratic Party an organization of terrorists. So that's very scary. That's very scary.
So Bob did ask the question. So what would have happened, or what if the military had refused Trump's orders? What would have happened to them?
Well, then he would have had to have found someone to court-martial them, because it would have been disobedience to orders. And the lawful defense to disobedience of orders is that I actually have a legal duty to disobey. But he would have to find someone to court-martial them, and the court-martial, so I would want members of the military to refuse to court-martial them, to refuse that order. But then there's legal authority within, that's vested actually within the civilian secretaries to actually convene courts martial. And then they would have and so it's upon pain of being prosecuted for refusing orders. And then you would have to just see, well, are the judges actually going to do the right thing and find that it was a manifestly unlawful order? Is it going to go to the Supreme Court? But the chill effect is very real when the president controls all those levers, except for, of course, the Supreme Court. But yes, but at some point, if enough people refuse to support the mechanics of a court martial, which require individuals in uniform in the military to actually fulfill the court martial function, that breaks down. Then he would have to try to turn to Attorney General Bondi, who's apparently willing to go after all of our First Amendment and constitutional rights. And I'm trying to remember where she went to law school, but she's very much willing to disregard the rule of law. I mean, she said she was going after hate speech earlier this week, which is clearly protected speech. She would have to try to figure out, but the Uniform Code of Military Justice is for court martial. The penal code, those provisions are not for prosecution within the DOJ and a civilian court. They could try, but that they have no statute to go. There is no disobedience to order crime under the federal 18 U.S.C. the federal code. So at the end of the day, yes, these people place themselves in peril by saying no, because there is a baseline assumption that all orders are lawful, right? So they've got to overcome that presumption. And the chill effect is real. The fear that they will be prosecuted, right? But at some point, individuals have to stand up and say, this is manifestly unlawful. We're not going to do it. And they get enough people and enough leaders to do it, then the entire machine grinds to a halt. And that's what I really wish would happen. I saw another hand up.
And we've got a lot of questions too in the Q&A. Can you see the questions in the Q&A so you can go ahead and answer them, or?
No, I actually can't, if you don't mind.
Okay,
Well, Penny, we've got a hand raised.
yeah, that was Denise, but she's right after Fatima.
Okay, just making sure you saw it.
Yeah, so Fatima says, if I can read, if the Supreme Court ultimately sides with the administration on using the Alien Enemies Act to summarily deport suspected gang members, how far does that expand to the presidential order? And could that precedent be applied to other groups in peacetime?
Well, sure. Thank you for that question. And the answer is sure, it could be applied to other groups. I mean, I'm hoping that the Supreme Court just won't take it. Because it sure seems like the administration is able to fulfill their deportations without it, because these immigration courts really are just extensions of the Attorney General's office, so they're not much of a court, even though they are a court. They're a judicial hearing and a proceeding, but they're not an Article 3 independent branch. So they're kind of, I view them as a bit of a joke anyway. These folks are not judges with any kind of protection from being fired. They do what the Attorney General tells them to do. So I think the Trump administration realized that they didn't even need to use the Alien Enemies Act to fulfill their self-imposed mandate. But that being said, if it does go to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court said, sure, just by President Trump saying there's an invasion without there actually factually being the factual predicate of an invasion, President Trump could say that Antifa, whatever that is actually invading the country. So we can deport everybody that's not a US citizen, that's 14 and over, that belongs to Antifa. And we really actually see an abuse of authority already under a component of the Immigration and Naturalization Act, with which the administration is using to deport individuals who are not U.S. citizens, based on what they say that because they pose a threat to basically a threat to national security, or pose a threat to successful completion of foreign policy. And those are for folks that have spoken out against, or spoken out in support of Palestinian rights. So we see an abuse of freedom of expression under a component of the INA. So yeah, I mean, the Fifth Circuit, which is one of the most conservative circuits in the entire United States, said, hey, there simply isn't the invasion. There are actually no facts to support there's no declared war and there's no actual invasion. And so I'd be highly surprised to say that the court can look at the same facts and say there is an invasion. Because if the court pretends that there's an actual invasion with this, then we're not limited by reality anymore, and we're not limited by facts. And I find much of what the current majority on the Supreme Court to be doing is making things up as they go along and not engaging in principled decision making. But I would hope that they wouldn't go this far. And I would hope, then that's why one of the reasons why I think the president has been leery and reticent and has not invoked the Insurrection Act, because the factual predicates for actually invoking the Insurrection Act simply aren't there. Of course, that the factual predicate I don't think was appropriately there normatively for him to invoke Section 12406 of the U.S. Code either, for federalizing the troops here in California, and that didn't stop him. But there were some facts. There was enough for at least a plausible argument, which of course the trial judge said no, there isn't. But there was enough there. But for the Insurrection Act, no. So I think the president his advisors and lawyers have been very careful to try to steer around. I mean, the Alien Enemies Act was such an overreach, but they're testing to see what a democracy, a constitutional democracy, can fall constitutionally. They can do all of this lawfully because there's such wide swaths of discretion, such ambiguous statutes that have been written by a Congress that trusted a president to use this discretion wisely. And that goes back to the title of one of my pieces. And I got this quote, I didn't make it up. It was Harold Koh, who's the dean of Yale Law School, was the legal advisor for the State Department under President Obama, but he said, it's awful, but it's lawful. There's a lot of this that I think you can find that was lawful, but is awful. I think the Alien Enemies Act, you can't find that it was lawful at all, because there simply wasn't the factual predicate for an invasion. But I'll stop there because there's other questions.
All right.
I think we'll take two more questions, Penny.
Okay,
Two
so
more.
I'm gonna jump down to Denise. So, what is the path forward? Is there any safety anywhere?
Yes, and I think it's things like exercising our First Amendment right for peaceful assembly, for getting together and marching, for going in front of, I think there are folks going today in front of, I forgot the network because it's been a very long day, at night, the network that Jimmy Kimmel worked for that just suspended him, and protesting and saying, no, this is ridiculous. We're not going to take this. Going to the ballot box, organizing. What is happening now did not happen overnight. This is the fruit of a tremendous, and I mean, you have to admire it, even though I dislike it, a tremendous amount campaign of strategizing and organizing and thinking about ends and how to get to these ends via particular means. This stuff isn't just randomly happening because President Trump's waking up and thinking about it. This is a campaign to erode our civil liberties and to basically turn our country into an authoritarian one. And so I think that means that folks that don't want to like that need to get together, need to organize, need to actually protest, need to be working with their elected representatives. And I do have to remind folks that all politics are local. And so by having the conversations and ensuring that our local governance is actually trying to work, can help as well. But the safe space, I have service member friends that are scrubbing all of their social media feeds because they're terrified that there's going to be retaliation and retribution, and they'll be a victim of an ideological witch hunt. There's been airline pilots that are being fired from their jobs because they've posted things that don't fall within the ideological mindset of the current administration. People are afraid, right? And we've, had law firms that caved. It's like, okay, at what point are we actually say no? Are we the frog in the pot that's actually boiled? Are we too boiled already to get out? I don't think so. I'm not going to buy that. I'm encouraging people to stand up and do the right thing and not to be so craven. This administration is relying on people to be afraid and to be bullied. We're letting ourselves be bullied. And I know I'm saying that makes it easier said than done. I get a military retirement. I rely on it. And so does my husband to pay for my mortgage. And yet I'm out and I'm subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I could be court-martialed tomorrow for contemptuous words against the president, which I find completely unconstitutional as a restriction against my speech. But I don't want to be court-martialed and have to be the one that has to argue it. It's scary. But if we're silenced, and I'll go to and I don't know the person that spoke initially, was the organizer here, but they mentioned that when the most vulnerable within our society is attacked, that usually shows that it's not going to stop there. And that just reminds me of the Martin Niemöller quote from Germany, from Nazi Germany. And first they came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist. And so I said nothing. Then they came for the Marxists. I'm not a Marxist, so I said nothing. Then they came for the Jews. I'm not Jewish, and I said nothing. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up for me. And I grossly just maligned that poem, but the essence is there, that we have to stand up and speak. We have our voices, we have our conversations, we have our relationships. We cannot be so afraid to stand up and say what we believe is the right thing. And we have to do that in unison. We are powerful as people together, and it's our unity, and not allowing us to be divided and look at my friends that I know who voted for Trump and say, I hate you. I don't hate you. I hate the way you voted and the way our country's going, but help me understand, and how do we reach a better place here? How do we look at facts the same way? Because we're entitled to our opinions. We're not entitled to our own facts. And there's so much misinformation out there. So I do think that educating ourselves, dialoguing, not focusing too much on issues that are so culturally divisive, not getting caught up in issues that are the most passionate to people, but trying to bring it down to some pragmatic points that we can all agree on, and then working from there, not giving up on those issues. Not saying we should be giving up on the most vulnerable in our society, absolutely not, but trying to find some common ground. I think one of the common grounds, let's look at the economy. Are these tariffs working? Let's find things that we all agree with. Who likes to be paying what we're paying for eggs at the grocery store? None of us, right? And so trying to find common ground and working within that, and not demonizing each other, being willing to sit down and talking without bullying each other and just talking to make some kind of performative point, but actually trying to understand where each other's coming from. I think that's it's harder. It's hard work, and it requires people getting out of their bubbles and actually interacting with one another. But I think we absolutely have to do it. We have to be willing to knock on doors and talk to people that we normally don't talk to.
I would just add that poem was written by a German resistor. He resisted fascism and Nazism from the very start. So,
He's a pastor, I believe. Yeah,
he was a German Lutheran pastor, right? And in the end, he was martyred.
Yeah, he was.
A strong, brave man, and he gave us all words.
I argue with myself all the time that I'm viewing these things in too dismal of a lens, so that I've been perhaps brainwashed by the liberal woke left. But I spent my formative years and 24 years on active duty in the military, fighting for our country and very much believing in our country. And there's something there, and we absolutely have to stop ignoring it. For those that want to pretend like nothing is going wrong, there's things that are terribly going wrong.
So maybe we should end there, Penny, and because we've taken a lot of your time, you've been so articulate, and you've given us not only the history and the legality, but you've given us a roadmap forward, which is to organize, participate, protest, and build a be part of a building public protest our only path forward. So thank you very much, Rachel VanLandingham. We appreciate this so much, and we wish you well, and we wish everyone who's attended well. Thank you.
Thank you for this, and thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your service, what you're doing day to day. We all have our service and we contribute in different ways. So thank you so much. And if folks ever want to chat with me, my emails is public. It's on the Southwestern Law School website where I have the honor of teaching and being tenured here. And I'm always happy to be debated and to look at other facts and to engage in discussion. So everyone have a wonderful afternoon and a good weekend. It's almost Friday.